Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 629. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here, and as usual, happy you're listening. I wanted to do something a little different. I've been talking about politics, which I don't really like to do. I say I don't like to do it, but then I do it, right? So I can't help myself. But I wanted to just back up, and I've been thinking about, when did I start thinking about these things? When did I really start on this path? And how long have I been thinking about some of these things? And really, I was trying to think back to what was the trigger, kind of what was the thing that got me interested in these topics, because I think I've shared on the show before. It's been a while, maybe very early on I shared on the show, but I think 2000, the .com bust or the .com crash really changed me. I don't want to say it changed me. That's maybe a bit too strong, but I really started to think to myself, what if, and this is like humility, lack of humility kind of, I guess, but I was thinking, what if all these people are wrong? Really, even before the .com crash, I was thinking about this, and this is going to sound really bad, but I went to college, and got an engineering degree. I largely did that because I was one of these people that kind of did what their parents told them to do. In my house, it was like, go to school, do the best you can, you don't have to make A's. I think my parents kind of knew I wasn't an A student, but it was like, go to school, learn something valuable, do the best you can, get out, get a good job, start working on a career, and do something, right? Find something you like to do and start doing it. And I think in general, this is good advice. I mean, I'm not saying that my parents gave me bad advice or anything, but I worked for a couple of years right out of school in a food manufacturing company. And at first it was really interesting because it was right in the wheelhouse of what I studied, industrial engineering, which is, manufacturing engineering. And, but then I started to bump up against, the corporate machine, and it started to occur to me that none of these people really care too much about what they're doing here. They talk about empowerment, they talk about quality, they talk about these things, but it just was like, I think I was maybe idealistic, I was naive, and I'm in this job. I worked the job about 2.5 years, and I get laid off. Now, at this time, people get laid off all the time now, but this was like 1992-ish, something like that. And I'd never even heard of anybody getting laid off. I mean, this was just news to me. I'd never heard of this. Nobody I knew had ever been laid off. This was just a brave new world for me. So I started to think, wow, what did I do wrong? What happened here? Anytime something happens, most people will take kind of an inventory of the situation. And I thought, I knew my parents grew up in a different generation. I knew the world was different when they grew up. And I thought to myself, what if they're wrong? What if they're not actually right about the advice they gave me? And my parents even today have great advice. I mean, it's not about their advice per se, but it's about recognizing the time that you live in, right? And noticing trends and also just noticing kind of what's real, what's not real, things like that. And then another thing happened around 2000 with the .com bust or crash. And I had made a little money, and I was putting money in the stock market, and just things didn't look quite right to me. It didn't feel right. I'd called my broker a couple of times and said, hey, let's take the money and just put it in cash and just sit on the sidelines. And three different times I talked to this guy, and three different times he talked me out of it. He gave me all the cliches, you can't time the market. You're going to miss the best 5 days of the year if you try to pull out or whatever. And maybe he's right, but at that particular time, I was right. And the idea that you can just hold through all these massive sell-offs, to me, it just didn't sound right. Like I could make 10% a year, and then in 1 year you lose 60%, and it's like, that just doesn't seem right, So anyway, that was a big deal for me. And then along about 2010, so after the financial crisis in 2008, I started paying attention more to the money side of things. There were huge bailouts. Why were these banks getting bailed out? And just all this stuff. Bottom line is my path was kind of mapped out by these major events in my life as I was growing up and having to be a young adult and things like this. And I was just thinking about all this stuff, over the last few days. And I remembered this video, this guy, Yuri Bezmenov, he was responsible for, he was a propagandist in the KGB during the Soviet Union. And I saw this video a long time ago. I'm not even sure when, but I was like, wow, this is one of these things where I noticed what this guy was saying was true. We've talked about this before. Like when you hear something, the truth has a certain ring to it. It has a certain sound to it where you can say, yeah, that's true, And I wanted to share some of this video with you. And then, of course, you can go watch the whole thing. And especially now when I look at America the way it is today, I can't help but think this guy was right. I mean, he was sounding a warning at the time that was very true. And it's almost easier to see now in retrospect. But some of you might be wondering, well, how did we get here? How did this happen? How do we have people that no matter what you tell them, no matter what you show them, they still believe something that's not even true? This is really, this is really something that it's a mystery. But I think when you listen to Yuri Bezmenov, you get a sense that this is all by design, right? This was always going to happen. The Soviet Union, if you go back and you really look at history and you listen and you study history from people that really know it, like and are really committed to understanding the causal mechanisms of history, World War I was a disaster, just an unmitigated disaster. For one thing, World War II, and this is not even in dispute, World War I led to World War II, which was even a bigger disaster. But probably the biggest disaster out of World War I was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was really a really bad chapter in world history. And a whole bunch of socialism and other states went to communism out of it. I mean, millions and millions of people died. I often talk about how the 20th century states, like the Soviet Union, like America, all the people that engaged in war, killed like 180 million people. The states did that, okay? Well, the Soviet Union was one of the biggest players, them and China. And so it's just, the Soviet Union was an unmitigated disaster. And when you listen to Yuri Bezmenov talk here in a second, what you're going to hear is that the Soviet Union is really what's causing, or the Soviet Union's Cold War against the United States is really what's causing a lot of what we have today. We have people that have undergone a type of transformation in America, and Yuri Bezmenov is going to talk about that in just a second. And I want to break in from time to time and play or talk about some of the things that he's discussing. But I just think this is, for me, especially looking back now, war is something that should be avoided just at all cost, because you never know what's going to ripple out of it. War is like a big rock that you throw into a lake, and it just ripples out, and it has all kinds of causal, linkages that we can't predict. And I know that a lot of these guys in Washington, D.C., they think they know. They spend a lot of time making fun of guys like me and say that I don't know. But what I do know is that they don't know. That's the most important thing. I know that I don't know, but I also know that they don't know. And nobody knows the future. And it's very difficult to predict. And especially in this kind of war environment where political factions rise and fall and things like that. So, but I think you're going to be really surprised about what he talks about. And I just think this is really interesting. But I want you to listen to it from what, you might be scratching your head. You might be thinking to yourself, what is causing America to be the way it is? Why are some people just completely ate up with racism, and America's a horrible nation, and white people are why are people so caught up with this, right? And I think you're going to hear some of this in Yuri Bezmenov. And if you don't hear it here, you'll hear it probably in the next episode or the episode after that, because I'm going to have kind of a little series here where I'm going to kind of step you through what we're experiencing in America and why. More importantly, why. So without further ado, let's start. I didn't do something here. Let me click on something real quick. There we go. Let me start Yuri Bezmenov, and I'll jump in here in a few seconds and just expound on just some of what he's talking about. Kind of put some color commentary behind it.
About ideological subversion. That is a phrase that I'm afraid some Americans don't fully understand. When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being...
All right, before we get to the stages, I want to just mention that, and you've probably heard this, that perception is reality. So on here we've talked about the media and how the media is controlled, and how we saw this during COVID big time. I mean, the perception during COVID was that we had this virus that was going to kill everybody, and that the government needed to save us. I mean, I'm embellishing a little bit here, but I want to make a point here that the government needs to save us, and only the government can come out with a solution that will be able to participate in, that will save us all and keep people from dying, and so on and so forth. And this is a type of PsyOpp. This is a type of controlled narrative with a central planning kind of theme behind it. And it changes people's perceptions, right? If your government, who you believe in and you want to believe in, and you learned about how great it is, everybody learned about how great America is in their 7th and 8th grade history class. If they're coming on TV and they're telling you these things, you have a tendency to want to believe it, right? And these, this becomes your reality. And for some people that are not fiercely independent, for example, this becomes their whole worldview. I mean, eventually it shapes their whole worldview, not COVID per se, but whatever the narrative is. The narrative is America's the awesomest of the most awesomest countries in the world, and we don't ever do anything wrong. Everything we do is for the good of the people. We're in public service. We represent the people. That's all we do. We're just here doing an honest day's job. This is a narrative that we all come to hear repeatedly, to the point where a huge portion of us just believe it. We just believe it. And that's our reality. And I mean, to the point where we can't unbelieve it. And I mean, you've heard people talk about how people sincerely believe something, like they sincerely believe they're helping, or they sincerely believe. Being sincere has nothing to do with being right. If you believe something and you believe something, if you believe the thing you believe in is wrong, then you're sincerely wrong. And this is why first principles are so important. And a lot of these first principles are in our Bill of Rights, okay? Free speech, okay? Just look at the Bill of Rights. It's loaded with first principles. And I used to listen to Stefan Molyneux a lot. And Stefan Molyneux used to talk about your senses, like your sense of smell and your taste and your hearing and your eyes. These are the way we perceive reality. Okay? But reality is just something we perceive. It's not like any one person or any group of people can point to something and say, that's reality. Okay? I talk about reality on this show a lot, but the reality is, I'm talking about reality. The reality is, reality comes from like agreement, talking back and forth, and then agreeing on something. Okay? I'm sitting in a chair. Well, how do we know it's a chair? Well, because we all agree that this is a chair. Or this is a microphone. How do we know it's a microphone? Because you can line up 1 million people and ask them what this is, and it's a microphone. They'll say it's a microphone. So there's agreement about what the reality of this microphone is. And so this is why free speech is so important, right? But when you have things like fiat money, and you can pay off news agencies, and you can pay off, and networks are controlled by just a handful of people who are connected to government and things like, they can change reality. Okay, they can change our perception of what we see, or what we think we see, what we believe, what we feel is right, what we feel is wrong. This is just, it's like we've said before, if you ask the fish, hey fish, how's the water? Well, the fish is like, what water? If the fish could talk, obviously. The point is, the fish doesn't know that he's inside, that he's in the water. That's just his environment. And so you have to think, you have to question. I did this thing years ago. It was called The Forum. It was really good, actually. But the way the guy started was really interesting. He drew a big circle on the board. And he said, this is all knowledge. This is everything that's known about everything. And he said, and each of you have something that you know, right? And he drew a real small circle. Inside the bigger circle, he drew a small circle. And he said, that's what you know. And he said, the question is, how do you get to know something that you know that you don't know? Right? So there's all knowledge, there's what I know, and there's what I don't know, and then there's what I don't know that I don't know. Okay? And the way you get to that is you question. You have questions, and you have debate, and you have back and forth. So like if you looked at Israel and Gaza, there are people on the TV telling us what that was. This is what it is. Okay? What if they're lying? Well, then you have to question, right? You have to say, well, what is it? It doesn't quite look like what they say it is, and so you start to question, you start to ask questions, and then you develop a set of answers, and there's a process, right? But it takes work to get outside that narrative. It takes work to say no to this narrative that they're trying to get you to perceive as reality. And this is what Yuri Bezmenov is talking about. Now, in the Soviet Union, it was a lot easier because the Soviet Union owned all the means of production. They owned all the studios. They owned the media. They owned the government. They owned everything. They owned businesses and so on and so forth. And they paid off who they wanted to pay off. And if somebody couldn't be bought, they shoot them in the head. That's the way they did things in the Soviet Union. And so in a lot of ways, we've become more like the Soviet Union because we have put people in power, or people have risen to power, let's say. We didn't put them there. They've risen to power in large media companies. And they've been willing to go along with whatever the narrative is that the government says must be. And it pervades our culture. It's in our movies. I mean, there was a while back, people were complaining about Disney movies and Disney things. Disney's embedding these ideas in their movies, and parents were pushing back. Well, those parents that were pushing back were questioning, right? They're like, no, that's not something kids should be seeing. So the tools against this type of thing that he's talking about are first principles, questioning, identification, things like this. This is how you fight back from some of these 4 parts that he's going to describe here. And this first one, I think, is the most damaging, and probably we've already been through it. And I'll expound on that a second after we listen to him talk about it.
In demoralization, it takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black. You still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. Obviously they will join the links of dissenters, dissidents.
Yes.
Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it.
All right, so this section, when I heard him talking about this, I think about people like Bernie Sanders or, what's the lady's name? The senator from Massachusetts, Pocahontas, or AOC. These people, they're not coming back from their worldview. This worldview, once you have this worldview, and later on we're going to do a show about the oppressor versus the oppressed. Once you kind of have that worldview, that's the way you see everything. Kind of like the same way I see money, dishonest money and everything. But, I mean, some of you might argue with me out there that my worldview is not anchored in principle or reality, but I think I could demonstrate that it actually is if we were in a debate. It's not something we're going to do here on this program, but demoralization, how do you do this? How do you actually pull this off? You use the education system, you use the media, you tell people things that really aren't. You tell them things like, white people are the worst scourge on the globe, and slavery was the cornerstone of American founding, and tell people things like this, and it just slowly chips away at what their ability to see their country as good and things like that. And then the government also is doing things that actually show that it's not good, which is odd, because those people that kind of badmouth America are also the ones that are pushing for the wars and stuff, which is kind of weird. So this demoralization thing, and I think, look, first of all, this video that I'm showing you, Reagan was president when this video was made. So this has been going on for a long time. And I think, to the degree that it hasn't happened faster is because we have this back and forth. You see this, well, the Trump people won, and they go and rule the government for, 4 years or 8 years or whatever, and kind of vanquish the other side. And then people see, they overstepped, and so they bring in the other party, which has more of these people that are demoralized in it. And they do things like bring in equity and equality and some of these values that are more of the demoralization. So you have, 4 or 8 years of demoralization, and then you have 4 to 8 years of trying to bring that back to reality. This is why you never really see the Republicans roll anything back in a meaningful way. It's because they're always trying to fight back what the Democrats did. And you can't ever get closer to principles, because the first thing you have to do is tear down what the Democrats did. And this is just this. So what ends up happening is you have this gentle fluctuation in the direction of demoralization. But that's part of the reason I think it hasn't happened already. Now, he's going to mention some other steps here in a few minutes that are coming, okay, probably. And some of them have already come, and maybe they happen multiple times. Maybe there's multiple crises. I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see how it plays out. It kind of reminds me of the time I was talking to my wife about some of this stuff, and she's like, well, what do we do? What should we do? And I said, you have to wait and see what happens, because it's like a chess match. You move and your opponent moves, and you make a move and your opponent makes a move. And then you make a move and your opponent makes a move. But you can't really, you don't know how those moves are all going to take place until they actually are made. Navigating this is going to be very similar to like playing chess, right? You're not going to know how to do all this in advance. There's not going to be a way to do that. So anyway, let's jump back into Yuri's comments. He's going to talk about these other three phases, or these other three parts of active measures, which active measures is just propaganda. It's a PsyOpp. This guy was the chief propagandist in the KGB. Okay, so this is what he knows. This is his area of expertise. Now, he defected I don't know a lot about him, but I know he defected to America and is kind of doing his part to he's probably dead now, but he was doing his part to beat back the Cold War and the Soviet era. So anyway, let's continue here and see what he's got to say.
Then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically, America is stuck with demoralization, and unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country.
Before we get into crisis, let's kind of explore this destabilization. And maybe we've had some destabilizing, certainly the financial crisis was destabilizing. But to me, just kind of looking back on it, there's been a couple of things recently that I think are very destabilizing. One is the war in Ukraine. Why is this very destabilizing? Because one of the things we did when that happened is we tried to remove Russia from the global economy. And this was a fatal mistake, actually, because when we did that, we pushed Russia out of the dollar system and forced them to go talk to China and India and some of these other places and try to figure out ways to trade in their currency or in gold or in oil or some other way. Because no country can survive without trading, really, because nobody makes everything. And so what the result of this is Russia and Russia's trading partners for whatever Russia was trading with or trading for have removed that part of the economy out of the dollar system. And this is going to be it continues to be very destabilizing to America, because one of the things America does, and I'm not saying this is good, in fact, I'm saying it's bad, but America, because we create so many dollars, we borrow so many dollars into existence, the bigger the pool of existing dollars that are being used, the less impact that is on any one individual, really globally, but especially here in the United States. So, in other words, if the pool of dollars is very small and the U.S. government creates a bunch of new dollars because it created a bunch of new credit, then inflation, you get a very sharp spike in inflation. But if the pool of dollars is very large because the entire world is using dollars, then the U.S. government can create a whole bunch of dollars, and it doesn't have as big of an impact. And think of like a bathtub, okay? And you jump in. Let's say you sit down in the bathtub. Well, the water level in the bathtub rises. Think of that as the inflation. So in the bathtub, the water level rises pretty significantly relative to the total amount of water, right? But if you go and you walk into a lake, okay, you get into a lake, the water level in the lake doesn't rise. I mean, you can't even notice the level rising in the lake, right? It's because the volume of water in the lake is so much greater relative to the addition of your body. Whereas the addition of your body into a bathtub full of water is a greater percentage of that total volume. So it has a more impact on the level. Inflation works the same way. If I print up a bunch of dollars and throw them into the economy that's the size of a bathtub, it's going to have a huge impact on prices. But if the economy is the size of a giant lake, well, then it's going to have less of an effect. So Russia leaving the dollar system, and it's not just Russia, it's whoever Russia's trading with, leaving the dollar system. So China has an interest in doing this, and some of these other countries that are kind of looked down upon by the United States, they have an interest in doing this. So, and this is why you have China kind of creating these gold exchanges along the Belt and Road project. And so anyway, this is bad for America, okay? So this is very destabilizing for America. The other thing, obviously, that's destabilizing is the whole immigration thing. Just the massive, same kind of concept, right? If you have a whole bunch of new immigrants, illegal or legal, it doesn't matter, your ability to assimilate them is diminished because of just the sheer numbers. And because we have a welfare system or a safety net system, and there's NGOs, there's these NGOs that just plug these people into these programs, and the money just starts flowing in their direction. You know, notice no NGOs are coming to your house helping you figure out how to get the U.S. government to pay for your housing or your food or whatever, or put you up in a hotel in Manhattan. Can you imagine? There's illegal immigrants staying in hotels in Manhattan. I think the cheapest hotel in Manhattan that you could find is probably $300 a night. Okay. And so this is very destabilizing. I mean, this is a huge draw on our savings, whatever savings we have. It's really not savings. It just creates more deficit, right? It's not savings. But these types of things are very destabilizing. And this is potentially what we're seeing. And of course, the next step is crisis. He's going to talk about crisis, but you can easily see how this dollar phenomenon plus immigration demands on our system and, whatever else is kind of lying underneath the surface, maybe derivative risk or just total dollar denominated debt in the world, which I think is over $150 trillion now. When you look at all this collectively, these things could be very destabilizing and could cause a huge upheaval in our system. And then it's interesting what he talks about next. So once you have a crisis, let's just listen to crisis. But then once you have a crisis, then the next step is kind of a takeover step.
To the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins, never mind. He will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system.
Yeah, this crisis, if you think about it, we've seen this before, where once you have a crisis, people really clamor for the government to do something. You get that, like, people, if you engage with people, they'll say, I don't know, but we need to do something. And when they say we, they're talking about the government, okay? And this is very, very dangerous, because this leads to this normalization, things are normalized now. Dodd-Frank, after the financial crisis, that normalized the banking system. The problem is it normalized it for the people in power, the people that are connected. It didn't normalize it for us, okay, for the people. It normalized it for there's always this talk about, especially with Bernie Sanders, the upper 1% or the 1/10 of 1%. But the real 1% that you should be concerned about is not the rich, okay, not the rich people, to the extent that they're independently rich, okay? If they're rich because they're connected to government, yeah, you should be worried about those people. But in general, you should be worried about the 1% that is the ruling class, okay? Or the elites, or whatever you want to call them. The people that have the ear of government and can exercise its force. That's the real 1% that you should be afraid of. And probably what he's saying is right. Once there's a crisis, there probably will be somebody come out and they'll say, things are normalizing. Things are normalizing. They're getting back to normal. The problem is what happened underneath the surface after the crisis is they rigged the game back in the favor of the people that it's always rigged for. So this just doesn't work for the individual American, this process. And it's not going to continue to work for America. The only reason it's worked as long as it has is because we have the dollar, and the dollar is the world reserve currency. But as I just discussed, that is going away slowly but surely by our own making. That's what's crazy about it. We're the ones causing that to happen. All right, so let's listen to his closing thoughts here, and then we'll have some closing thoughts of our own, and we'll wrap up.
And the initiator of this war is not Comrade Andropov, of course. It's the system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system, or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to, unless you want to live in Antarctica with penguins.
Okay, I think that's a great way to maybe wrap this up. Is look, there is no other place to go to. This is it. America is the last place. Look at what's happening in Great Britain. Great Britain's generally perceived to be free. They've got people, if you say something mean about homosexuals online, they come to your door and arrest you and take you to jail because you hurt somebody's feelings. I mean, that's where the UK is. Or if you say something bad about Muslims online, or even in public, if you say something bad in public, or if let's say you're a preacher and you want to read from the Bible in public, you just want to stand on the corner and read the Bible out loud. They are arresting people like that in Great Britain. Okay? So you cannot go to Great Britain. Okay. Germany, you want to roll the dice and go to Germany? Anywhere in the EU is kind of captured in the same way that the United States has captured all the states. You still have Italy in these places, but more and more the power of the EU is moving in lockstep. Spain, Germany, Italy, France, all the surrounding countries, their policies are in lockstep with one another. There is no individual, what are the Germans like and what are the French like and what are the Italians like? That's not happening anymore. There's some pushback. You see that with in Italy with Melonia or whatever her name is. You see it in Poland, okay, with the guy in Poland. There's pockets of it. Those countries don't have that culture of freedom. They're just not great places to escape to. They're great places to visit. Definitely go visit Europe if you haven't been. But you can't sit there and say, I'm going to flee to Europe because that's where freedom is. No, that's not where freedom is. Freedom here, and I've talked, remember he's talking about generations. Once you have a certain number of generations, I think that's true with like free markets and capitalism. I think if we don't get this thing turned around now, and when I mean now, and let's say over the next 3 years, it's not going to get turned around. I mean, it's already going to have to come to my kids' generation, because my generation, the generation that I grew up in, is now part of the problem. They're part of this group of people that if you go show them a concentration camp, they just won't believe it. They're not going to believe it until the bullet strikes them in the head. Remember how he talks about, you heard Yuri Bezmenov talk about how I call them the useful idiots, but the people that are helping foment or agitate for communist, socialist, Marxist ideas, they somehow believe that these ideas will result in some sort of land of equality or utopia or someplace like that. But he talked about, look, once they figure out that it's not that way, they're going to be very unhappy. And they're going to be so unhappy that eventually the way you deal with those people as a government is you just bullet to the head. Okay, there's no kind of pacifying those people, because once they realize their error and it's too late. The error is recognized too late, and at that point there's no pacifying those people, so that's why they get killed. They get killed and they got killed in the Soviet Union, they got killed in Vietnam, they got killed in Cambodia, they got killed in every place, in Korea, and every place that they had communists. These type of people were just murdered out of existence because they all of a sudden realize, oh shit, what I've been advocating for is not actually working, and we got to roll this back. Well, that's too late at that point. So they end up going away. All right, everybody, I think that's going to be it for today. Like I said, I'm going to do a little series on this, so come back and listen to the subsequent shows. It's going to be in the same vein, but in the meantime, go and subscribe to the show. If you're a listener, jump over to YouTube and click the video, watch an episode there, like and subscribe. And if you're so inclined, go out and write me a review and comment on the show. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thanks for coming in, everybody. Peace.